Welcome everyone, thanks for joining us. I'm Zoe Allen-Robinson. I chair the SRA's Accessibility Network and I head up the Anti-Money Laundering Proactive Supervision team here. I'm a qualified solicitor and an advocate for an inclusive and diverse profession. Today we're discussing the important topic of neurodiversity. An estimated 15 to 20% of people are neurodivergent, and this is a term used to describe conditions such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia and dyspraxia, but many find this to be a barrier when it comes to finding work. And research published last year by the Office for National Statistics, for example, found that just 22% of autistic adults were employed. As chair of the SRA's Accessibility Network, I'm delighted that we are discussing this topic today. As we know, the legal sector is highly competitive and we see very low disclosure rates around disability compared to the national statistics. Also, knowledge and understanding around disability and in particular neurodiversity is lacking. And for me, it raises concerns about the appropriateness of recruitment processes in the legal sector that potentially result in a lack of diversity or internal practices within firms that fail to retain diverse talent, for example, due to a lack of adjustments for people to thrive. And this has been a topic that is close to quite a few of our members in the network. So it's great to see this conversation being brought to a wider audience. It's really important that we challenge stereotypes about neurodivergent conditions, which unfortunately still very much exist, and current workplace structures are predominantly geared toward what is perceived as normal, meaning we're missing out on talent and diversity of thought that we know is proven to be good for business. It also means that having diverse lawyers ensures a better representation of the clients that they serve. So it's important that we challenge assumptions around neurodiversity and around what should be normal and create workplaces which are inclusive of everyone's neurological makeup so that we can get the best out of our people. So I'm delighted to be joined by Amelia Platten today, founder of the Neurodiverse Lawyers Project and future trainee solicitor. Amelia is autistic and dyspraxic and has set up an Instagram page where she shares her experience and also has a podcast series where she interviews neurodivergent lawyers from across the sector. After discovering that many other neurodivergent lawyers shared their frustrations in feeling alienated in the sector, Amelia set up the Neurodiverse Project, which provides resources that empower neurodivergent people to enter the legal profession. She spreads awareness about different neurodivergent conditions and advocates for change in the legal sector. The project is led by the belief of experts by experience, as it's run by neurodivergent lawyers and aims to amplify their voices and experiences. The project now has 50 volunteers and was awarded Finest Use of Social Media in 2022 by Legal Cheek. And Amelia's work has been mentioned in a number of articles, including The Times and student career site Prospects. So we'll begin by hearing from Amelia and then we'll move to a question and answer. And as part of that, we really want to hear from you. So please do use the link below the video and enter your questions. We already have a number of pre-submitted questions that Amelia will answer actually in part through her presentation and we'll cover those at the end. But do get any questions through early as the system can be a little slow and it means we get a chance to answer them at the end. So I'm now delighted to hand over to Amelia, who is going to share with us a little more about the Neurodiverse Lawyers Project. She's going to cover barriers faced by neurodivergent lawyers and some advice for firms around building inclusive workplaces.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you, Zoe, for that, and thank you all for joining today. So yes, as Zoe said, I'm autistic. I was diagnosed earlier this year at 24 after over a decade of complex mental health, like many undiagnosed women, and just basically reaching my breaking point. I don't fit the stereotype. I'm female, have always done well academically, but not in maths and science, and I can communicate reasonably well. My diagnosis coincided with when I started seriously looking into particularly training contracts in the sector, which was when I realised that there was quite a sizable issue. And despite the diagnosis being a hugely positive thing for me, I kind of suddenly found myself in that same hole again. Throughout this, I'll talk a little bit more about my experience and how we can build more inclusive workplaces and practices. But please remember, this is just a short presentation, so please be wary that this is just an overview, predominantly based upon my own experience and what I've learned. And this will hopefully be a placeholder for more conversations and change. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about neurodiversity and the movement that has come out of that. I'm sure most of us at this point have heard of the term, but what does it actually mean in practice? So neurodiversity refers to the classification of different types of cognitive functioning as natural variances rather than medicalised deficits and disorders. Neurodiversity is much more about than just simply celebrating different sorts of people and their talents. Whilst that's obviously very important, it's also about recognising that certain things are just more difficult and may require assistance. So neurodiversity includes neurotypical people, which a lot of people don't realise, which is cognitive functioning that generally fits within the wider norm, but obviously can have variances within, such as certain mental health conditions. And it also includes neurodivergent people, which is what a lot of people refer to when they're referring to neurodiversity, which is cognitive functioning that differs from the general norm. Like Zoe mentioned, neurodivergence therefore includes things like autism and specific learning difficulties. However, the term is an umbrella one and also includes things like Down syndrome, epilepsy, borderline personality disorder, OCD, and many more. In this presentation, I'll be mainly referring to autism and specific learning difficulties, so please be wary that the term is actually much broader than that. I just can't cover them all in this time. So, whilst neurodivergent is often used as this umbrella term, the first thing I want to get into is that it's really important to appreciate the differences between these neurodivergences. There are some common traits, like, for example, organisational difficulties across ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, but it's best to avoid overgeneralising. Equally, traits can differ massively from person to person with the same neurodivergence. For example, some autistics will like daily routines that they'll find it hard to deviate from, or like me, they'll just have micro routines around certain points of their day, which is why it's always best to engage in conversations with individuals rather than making presumptions about their traits. Finally, one thing that I wanted to draw your attention to even, was due to media representation, medical bias, and a lack of research in the field, we often associate these neurodivergences with certain groups of people, for example, autism with white males. However, it's important to note this has been widely discredited at this point, and that neurodivergent people can be literally anyone and look any way, regardless of age, sexuality, gender, race, economic status, or even whether they have another disability. Under the neurodiversity movement, it's really important to remember people still are and have these neurodivergences before they get the formal diagnosis. Many people will get this quite late in life. I'm sure many of you will have seen the year-long wait list or the costs upwards of £1,000. So we should not be waiting for someone to produce a piece of paper before we start making things accessible and inclusive. Ultimately, like Zoe alluded to, approximately 1 in 7 people are neurodivergent in the UK. And whilst it is thought that, unfortunately, up to 40% of those are unemployed, predominantly made up of that 22% of autistic figure, the chances are that there is or will be someone in your firm or business who is neurodivergent, whether you know it or not. So I've put a few notes on terminology used by the community, but obviously it's really important to take account of individual preferences when it comes to this. It can be very different depending on who you speak to, but this is just generally the kind of consensus. The first is using identity first language, so autistic rather than with autism. This eventually signifies how integral autism can be to people's lives, and also, again, alludes to the social model of disability rather than this medicalised deficits and deficiencies model. The second is to avoid using terms like superpowers, as this can create unrealistic expectations on neurodivergent people. Similar with anything that focuses too much on neurodivergent strengths or the benefit without acknowledging the challenges faced in society or the support that may be required by people. Personally, I tend to avoid binary classifications like strengths, weaknesses, positive, negatives, as in certain contexts, these things can be synonymous. For example, as a dyspraxic person, my condition will make me struggle with my organisation. But because I concentrate so much on that to try and mitigate that, I often end up being more organised than certain neurotypical people in the business. So many traits will also be referred to in this presentation as differences rather than deficits, to appreciate that there's not just one exhaustive way to do something right. For example, you may have heard in reference to autistic people, social differences rather than social deficits. Hopefully you can all understand what I'm saying today, but it may be considered a slightly different way. My eyes tend to drift, my body language will often fluctuate from too much to too little, but it isn't necessarily wrong. You're still understanding what I'm saying. And two final ones is avoiding things like, I'm a little autistic too, we're all on the spectrum somewhere, as it can be quite diminishing to people's experiences. And just a final one on the use of functioning labels. Generally, it's considered now that we avoid kind of binary classifications like high functioning, low functioning. Never assume what someone's functioning is. You never know what's going on behind closed doors or what someone struggles with, and it can be very harmful to accessing the right support. So I'm now going to move on to some of the issues, which feeds nicely into why I set up NDLP. So as I alluded to before, when I started applying for training contracts and paralegal roles, I faced a number of issues, particularly in recruitment. Things like bias, lack of reasonable adjustments and unsuitable processes, even in firms that boasted inclusivity and disability awareness. I'd already spent a lot of my life feeling like an alien looking in, and so this was really, really difficult to cope with. I really felt quite hopeless. In university, I noticed there was barely any events that catered to neurodivergent people, and firms' websites barely even mentioned it. Working in the sector, I would get overwhelmed, have panic attacks in the toilet, no reasonable adjustments, and again, just felt quite isolated from the profession. I'd speak to people in the profession, and the amount of misconception, prejudice, and occasionally ignorance that I heard was quite astonishing. I was called rude for my lack of eye contact and general lack of smiling, ditzy and slow for how I would muddle up my words, and it made me desperately want to challenge what the stereotypical lawyer is and looks like. When I was diagnosed as autistic, I was terrified. I felt like that would be it for me. My mental health took a deep dive yet again, and everyone in firms would tell me, well, you just need to think about whether you'll fit in here. There was never any impetus on firms to change, despite having nothing to support neurodivergent applicants or staff. I knew it was going to be difficult. That figure that Zoe stated, about 22% of autistic people being in employment, just constantly circled around in my head. And I also had no confidence to apply either because of this. I remember a recruiter asked me at my current firm, have you ever considered applying here? And without reason, I just said flat out, no. I'd had enough. And so I decided to set up my Instagram to see whether anyone had shared the same experience. I found literally hundreds of people that had faced the same or worse, from junior to senior, to those who had disclosed, to those who had not. Some of these stories even brought me to tears. I researched figures online and saw things like the legally disabled research and statistics on neurodiversity in the workplace, and I was just shocked. I saw very little tellings of the stories of these people, predominantly just numbers. So I decided to set up the project to raise awareness of these stories and to offer support. Since then, I've found more and more issues as I've gone along. When we started outreach with firms, we realised just how little understanding and often real change was going on. Whilst I now have a training contract, the horror stories that I've heard terrify me, and I would just like to have a small part of ensuring at least one person does not have to face what I did. Now, there are a lot of issues, far more than I can go through in 20 minutes, but I thought it would be useful just to provide an overview, as it provides kind of a nice context to the next section on how to build an inclusive workplace. So the first one is a general lack of focus on neurodiversity and hence representation. It was found a few years ago by the SRA that whilst 96% of firms had an equality and inclusion policy in place, only 20% had one for disability. It was also found that only 5% of solicitors were disabled versus 14% in the general population, with no statistics specifically on neurodivergence. I saw very few people to look up to. They are there, but it's not always overtly obvious, but I just didn't bother applying because I didn't think I would ever get in. The second is a lack of focus on varied skills profile. What I mean by this are there are many misconceptions about neurodivergent people. We're slow or we're lazy or we're over emotional or whatnot. And then there are the sweeping over generalizations of our strengths. We will be, 200% more productive. We will be continually fantastic problem solvers. But what happens is that people either expect one or the other. Just like neurotypical people, we have our own individual strengths and weaknesses, and it's really important to take account of this, as otherwise we often end up micromanaging or putting people down and stagnating careers, or just generally not providing the right support and expecting too much from neurodivergent people. The third is an obvious one, it's discrimination. I'm sure some of you may be aware of the legally disabled research that found more than half of disabled people in the profession had faced discrimination at some point, covering everything from lack of reasonable adjustments to just making people feel like a burden for having them, or things like bullying, misplaced paternalism. But it can also be quite subtle. For example, like thinking an autistic person is rude because of their lack of eye contact or direct communication, and then unconsciously not giving them a fair share of the most interesting or promotional work. Fourthly, this is how it's always been done mentality. True inclusion of neurodivergent people can sometimes involve a shift away from those traditional methods of working. We've seen some really good strides since the pandemic, but there's still some way to go. And also battling the presenteeism that still exists in some firms. Normally, if I wasn't near a boom mic, I would be fiddling with a stum noi here. Would that affect my ability to work? No, but will it be looked down upon by certain people? Yes. And finally, a very real issue is the over-reliance on medical diagnosis and disclosure, and only offering support after this is in place. As I've alluded to before, it's very, very difficult to get a diagnosis. Weight loss can be years long, and even then there is a lot of bias within the diagnostic process still. Disclosure is a personal choice, and many people are very wary of it for obvious reasons. We need to be thinking about an inclusive workplace, regardless of whether people are shouting about it or being open about it. Just a final part on this slide. This is very important. The rates of mental health conditions, and particularly suicide amongst neurodivergent people, particularly autistic people, are very, very high. A key factor stated in much of the research in this area was under or inaccessible employment. Neurodivergent inclusion needs to be taken seriously, and the benefits of cognitive diversity can be vast, as Zoe has alluded to. Now I'm going to move on to how we can rectify some of these issues, or at least in part. I think the slides are stuck, so I apologise that.
Yeah, I think that's unfortunate, Amelia, but if we carry on with the content, okay. And we'll share the slides. So sorry, viewers, okay. For that. Thanks, Amelia.
Okay. So I'm going to move on now to how to create an inclusive workplace. The first thing that I really want to mention here is that there is definitely no one size fits all. Everyone will require different things, but there are some more general things you can do. But like I said, this is in no means exhaustive. The first thing I want to mention is that these adjustments will often help more than just one individual. Everyone does things differently. Everyone will have things happen which affect their ability to work in certain ways. And at the end of the day, different life situations will also call for workplaces to adapt. Many of these will be very simple and inexpensive, and often these things are put in naturally for neurotypical people, but the mention of a reasonable adjustment makes people worry a little bit. People aren't always asking for the world here. Sometimes it just has to be seen as what it is. I'm asking for a quiet room. I'm asking for a little bit more time to do this task. Teams with neurodivergent people have been cited in multiple bits of research now as being more productive, having high attention to detail, and generally being more content. Most of the reasons stated behind this was because employers are becoming more flexible in the need to having different types of people in their organisation. So the first point here is to value a person holistically. That might seem quite vague, but there will be days when certain neurodivergent employees can easily meet or even exceed targets, but there may also be days when they cannot. I recently went through a period of autistic burnout and I could barely concentrate for more than an hour, but now I'm out of this, I can work for very long hours, hyper-focusing, without even taking a break. This kind of levels itself out, but you have to be wary and flexible as an employer. It's also important to be flexible with the types of tasks. Is there certain jobs that a person is really good at that you can assign them and then task swap with someone else? For neurodivergent people, you have to kind of rid yourself of that notion that every employee has to do and bring the same types of things to your firm. That's the benefit of cognitive diversity. Similarly, if we look at it more holistically and realise that someone has added value beyond just a specific goal or target, like, for example, enhancing the efficiency of a process, we may be better able to integrate neurodivergent individuals. As I'm not going to claim that everyone's a great problem solver, but it's a common strength amongst neurodivergent people. Thirdly, it's to become informed and actively aware of what neurodiversity is. I think we hear this term often and we think, okay, yeah, I know what that is, but it can be quite complex. There's quite a lot to learn within it. I would always say strive to learn as much as possible from neurodivergent individuals. Don't be frightened of making mistakes. I think it's more important to learn from them. In my perspective, the occasions where individuals fully avoid it at times are when I feel least included. Please keep in mind that obviously neurodivergent people are not free consultants, but it's okay to ask questions if they have time and are willing and, importantly, psychologically able to answer them. Fourth is to challenge bias and actively evaluate where it may be manifesting itself. This can obviously be really difficult to pinpoint, which is why step 2 is so important. It may be as simple as, for example, as a autistic person, I don't necessarily understand hierarchies. I may miss some of the social rules governing treatment of senior members of staff, but should I be penalised for that? No, I'm not doing it maliciously. I just don't understand the whole idea of hierarchies. But you have to grasp the intricacies first in order to appreciate it, or you may discriminate without realising. And then it's about reviewing what you're doing on a regular basis and also accepting feedback. A lot of people are obviously very concerned about this because obviously there's the whole legal ramifications of getting things wrong. But to give you an example, I did my assessment centre twice at my firm because of an issue with reasonable adjustments. What's important is that they are receptive and proactive to the feedback on this. I did mine again, and it was literally the specimen of what it should be. I'd rather this than firms pretend everything is perfect when it's not. It shows me the firm is committed to change and is going to be flexible. Then just a few couple of points at the end. Clarity is very, very important. What do you want? By whom? By when, even to whom? Always provide additional information on everything from socials to statements. It can make all the difference. Also, it sounds very simple, but ensure that your firm has a clear way to access and ask for adjustments in your firm. Don't always wait for someone to come knocking to ask about how they do it, because it can be an extremely stressful process. And then it's about being wary of things like, for example, rejection-sensitive dysphoria. Many neurodivergent people have this. Basically, rejection, perceived failure, or feeling like you're unliked by someone can cause a very big emotional response. Trust me when I say that sometimes it can feel physically painful. So it's about them being constructive in your feedback and not overly harsh with it. And then the final 2 points, flexibility. Work practices from hours, setting, even down to workwear. But be aware of how these may alter. Today, I want to work in complete stillness with my headphones on in a darkened room. Tomorrow, I may want plenty of noise and light. Always regularly check in with that person to make sure that their needs are not changing. And finally, this again sounds very simple, but it's not something a lot of firms do, and that's to actively include it in your D&I practices as an individual segment of disability. Sounds simple, but we want to know that we're wanted beyond you just complying with the Equality Act. Be transparent, publish figures about how many disabled people or even specifically neurodivergent people are in your firm. Use social media, create spaces for open conversations on this. Neurodiversity or disability is not a dirty word, it can be talked about. So, thank you all for listening today. Just to sum up, I wanted to re-highlight 4 specific points that I really hope you take away with you. The first is something I've alluded to a lot, and that's to stop waiting for neurodivergent people to speak up, because it's probably not going to happen. Secondly, start seriously reviewing where things may be going wrong. It's important, and it doesn't need to be a scary area. a lot of people are very open to talking about it. And sometimes, like I said in my example, it's better to review things and amend things rather than just to continually not do anything. The third is to value varied skills profile. And the fourth is, hopefully, as I've evidenced today, that it doesn't need to be rocket science. Obviously, please remember this is just an overview. There are a number of amazing resources and charities you can learn from on this area, and you can also learn more from neurodivergent individuals in the sector on our website, podcast and Instagram for free. So back to Zoe.
Thank you, Amelia, ever so much. And apologies all for the technical issue we're having with the slides. So just to reassure you that we'll send the full pack of slides to all registered delegates as part of our evaluation at the end, and they'll be available on our events webpage. So really sorry about that. But thank you, Amelia, for sharing your experiences and some really useful and practical advice for us to take away. So we'll move on to some of the questions we've had submitted. And I think this first one you have talked about a bit in your presentation, and you mentioned in terms of issues with the recruitment process. I think for you personally, there was some challenge around a lack of representation, so seeing that you could work at a particular firm. But I think it'd be really helpful, and some of the questions we've had are around this that have been submitted, which parts of the recruitment process are particularly problematic for neurodivergent individuals, and how can firms improve these processes? I think one thing you touched on that I probably emphasise here is this, really thinking about your job descriptions and, what do you need? Absolutely, if there are characteristics with a client-facing role, but really question, are we just asking for this because we have done in the past, or is it necessary for the job? But I'll hand over to you. Is there any other examples that you've seen that have not worked well and that firms could do better?
Yeah, I think, like you say, there's a variety of issues, particularly in the legal profession, because particularly assessment tends to be quite standardised. I could go through a big, long list of disability confident and what that means and how it often doesn't materialise. But I think the thing is, we're often not looking for neurodivergent traits, like you say, or we are, but we're not kind of overtly putting it out there as this is what we're looking for. So I guess the first thing to mention within that is just a general thing about mitigation, ensuring it's actually being taken into account by interviewers. Often this doesn't require training. Well, it does require training and at least some understanding of how neurodivergency presents itself. In terms of specific parts of the recruitment process, there was a very interesting BBC documentary recently on the use of AI video interviews, which is quite interesting. And the use of psychometric and situational judgment testing that have been under scrutiny for how they can exclude neurodivergent people, predominantly, again, because they're looking for a set criteria, which is often kind of neurotypical attributes, or at least holistic attributes like things like eye contact, body language, etc. Obviously, many of these centres have been designed with neurotypical people in mind, from the length to the amount of breaks to processing heavy tasks to on-the-spot thinking, all can cause substantial issues for neurodivergent people. Then they're marked again on neurotypical communication and processing speeds, etc. This is even before we start looking at whether reasonable adjustments are put in correctly, which I can tell you in a lot of cases they're not. I think there is this fear that it's going to give this undue advantage, but we really already have that huge disadvantage when it comes to most recruitment processes. Again, I would say it's about providing as much information beforehand as possible, which may include the questions beforehand. I know that's quite contentious with some firms. And then just generally having a conversation with the actual person, having some expertise to know what could be asked, so you don't just rely on the individual to educate you on their disability is quite important. Many neurodivergent people will find the process much more stressful, give longer breaks, check in to see if they're all right, review how inclusive your process is, how many neurodivergent people are actually successfully passing through the stages, and if they're not, which stage is causing the issue. And again, like Zoe said, it's about thinking, what do we actually need to get from this? For example, your 6-page application may be really, really difficult for a dyslexic person, and it's probably putting a lot of them off applying to you, and you've just got to wonder if it's really necessary. I understand that there's often a lot of applicants in this area, but sometimes it's just looking into those applications a little bit more and seeing them more holistically. And then again, asking for feedback, providing certainty as much as possible, both in your choice of language and the events that happen, providing those adjustments. And sometimes you need to think about the small things as well. Like, for example, if it's virtual and you've given someone permission to print the questions off, it's about thinking, okay, we might need to extend the break that they have by a couple of minutes to allow them to do that, so it doesn't eat into that thing. It's not always these big, huge adjustments. Sometimes it's just about putting some thought into it. And then again, in terms of interview questions, if you ask me a question with more than one clause, it will literally go in one ear and out the other. As we've mentioned, ensuring you're marking someone down, not ensuring that you're marking someone down on their own traits, like my words get muddled, I don't give eye contact. I'm always going to score badly on communication if we're judging it by neurotypical means. So just be wary of where you're placing weights. But that was a ramble, but that is generally what I would say.
No, not at all. I think there's some really good snippets in there, and having conducted a number of recruitment exercises myself, I think that it doesn't have to be as difficult as it sounds. Like you said, little things about if there are things you do advertising that, so that people are aware that, you know, what the office might look like, that there will be breaks, that this isn't about catching people out, so that people can write down the questions or have a printed copy in the interview, to show that if you disclose, this is the kind of response you're going to get, I think. But as you say, what is it we're testing here? Are we testing your ability to, respond on the spot? And is that going to be the kind of role you're going to have? Or actually, is it someone that's going to be preparing written documents? And what is the appropriate assessment process? We've had a question from Samantha that also covered off the recruitment process, but asked about the marking criteria for the SQE, and whether it's ABA list. And I think this is something I've looked in for you, Samantha. This was a pre-submitted question. So what I would say is the primary objective of the SQE is to remove barriers and increase access and flexibility in how individuals qualify, including neurodiverse candidates. So I've looked into this, and the following provisions are available for individuals. So additional time and breaks, separate room, reader, recorder, JAWS software, coloured overlays, adjustable font, adjustable contrast, and Zoom text have all been used. So these are there to ensure that a candidate is not disadvantaged by reason of a disability in demonstrating their competence as a solicitor and taking the SQE assessments in a way that ensures equity. The other thing I wanted to mention on this is that we're setting up an assistive technology forum containing employers, education and training organisations, disability representative bodies and disability experts to help us understand how companies are recruiting and providing reasonable adjustments to disabled candidates. And this will help inform how we develop the SQE going forward. And I will mention, that if there are things that we can share, we as a regulator, we should be sharing that with firms so that they can look at their own practices. Was there anything on the SQE that you wanted to add there, Amelia, or did you want me to move on to one of the other questions?
I'm doing the LPC, so I don't want to talk on it. I don't have much experience with it. But like you say, I think there's good things coming. Obviously, there is a bit of a gap in terms of the attainment of pass marks for disabled people. But I'm sure as they go along, it will be looked into more.
Great, thank you. So we've had another question that's been submitted while I've been talking about any views on how to cope with and whether you should proactively flag neurodiverse status at networking or external business events. And I think one thing for me would be a kind of plea to our audience, if we've got law firms listening in, is that if somebody does disclose this, that you think about, well, how else can we enable them to have build those important connections? Could we offer a separate call or an opportunity to talk with some of the people they really want to speak with? But I don't know, Amelia, have you had experience of this in terms of the networking events and kind of your guidance, whether you have disclosed or, this feels quite a personal choice, but really interested in your thoughts?
I think the reason why some people might know me is I had a LinkedIn post that got kind of about 2,000 likes on it, that was about my first firm social, where I essentially left it crying. What I will say is obviously I have this profile. There's not really much of a way for me to hide it. And so I kind of always go in quite open about it. But the thing is, I think a lot of people don't realise that reasonable adjustments also apply to these settings as well, and that you can ask for them. For me, having a separate room that's obviously quieter is very, very important. Firms giving me a little bit more information beforehand about who will be there and the context of the day is really, really helpful. Obviously, like Zoe said, there is some things that firms need to be doing. I think a lot of the time it's just an impetus on, okay, go and network in this big empty room. But like Zoe said, sometimes it is about a separate call, or even just making sure that people are kind of positioned at random points around the room, so it's not just one big kind of huddle of people, can be really important. But I think it's completely up to you whether you share. I personally have actually found it quite beneficial, because I think at the end of the day, you never actually know who you're stood next to. A lot of the times when I've kind of started talking about it, you discover, oh, that person's also neurodivergent, or that person has a neurodivergent child, and it kind of becomes a talking point within itself. It's not an uncommon thing to be or have someone close to you who's neurodivergent. And so I'm quite proud of it, and I ask very forwardly about firms and what they're doing for neurodiversity at these events, because ultimately that's a big part of my identity. So I would always encourage people to be open, but again, remember the reasonable adjustments, and also firms do need to be looking sometimes about how they can make these events more inclusive.
That's great, thank you, Amelia. So we've also had a question about how would somebody go about telling prospective employers about their ADHD condition and dispelling any of their preconceived, possibly negative notions if they had any.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say, because obviously most firms will have their own process for that. I appreciate that it's sometimes hard to find if you don't disclose at particularly at the commencement of your employment, because a lot of the kind of things are geared towards more junior people entering organisations, which is a problem in itself. But I would always have a sit down and think about who you want your first port of call to be when you disclose. In my experience, I've always tried to pick someone who I feel comfortable around, or have had conversations around this type of thing, who I feel is quite open beforehand. My advice again, please appreciate that I'm kind of coming from a point of privilege, in the sense that I don't even really need to disclose it's already out there. But my advice would always to try and be very direct and transparent about it. Own it. Dependent on who you do say it to, sometimes you might have to say a little bit about why you need the adjustment. Not that legally you need to do that, but sometimes it can help. Remember that there are services like Access to Work to help fund certain adjustments. So I think it's always worth floating something, even if you think, this might be a bit expensive for my firm. If you don't know what you need, there's some great resources again, and you and your manager can access that, and should access it, because it needs to be kind of a two-way process, so to speak. I think it's useful, again, to probably write down a few notes of what you find difficult and need some support with. Chat with other neurodivergent people to see what they have, although obviously it will be different. It's useful. And I think in terms of kind of challenging negative perceptions, I think we've all tried to do this at some point. I think the thing to remember is that you can't always change the world overnight. It's very demoralizing, I know, but please remember that it's not all on you. I think if you do want to educate, then obviously you can perhaps float the idea of training, or even set up kind of a workplace event yourself, which can be good to share your own experience. But also, realise that your knowledge, I'm not talking necessarily monetarily here, but your knowledge has value. And if it's kind of taking over as kind of a second job or whatever, then just be wary of that. But again, like I said, a lot of the time when I've disclosed, I've realised that someone else is neurodivergent, or someone has a neurodivergent child or whatever, so understands it a lot more. I wouldn't necessarily go in with the presumption that there is going to be an issue. Obviously, there may be some time. And then in terms of kind of coping with things retrospectively, if it doesn't go well, obviously there are some great charities and even legal organisations if you need it. But again, it's just, put yourself first in that situation. The diagnostic process is very, very difficult anyway. You don't need this added stress on top of it. So just try and, be transparent, keep transcripts of everything that's going on. And yeah, sometimes it's just about giving people the benefit of the doubt.
Thanks, Amelia. And I think there's two sides to this in terms of how we create an environment that people feel comfortable to disclose, and then also employers thinking about, how is it a fair process across the board. And I think this is not about saying that you don't achieve the same objectives from an employer that's neurodivergent. They will still have the same goals, whether it's an organisation that is target or time recorded driven. But what we're trying to do here is also open up people's minds that there's different ways to get to that point, and it's enabling people. It's not necessarily a straightforward is a reduction for this person fair on other members of staff. It's actually, it may well be exactly the same, but how we reach it and whether they have access to quieter rooms or different tasks, as you were talking about earlier. So I know we've had a few comments come in along those lines. I just wanted to stress that point. And I think for this individual, talking about disclosure, we also there is a responsibilities on managers and people managers to simply ask when they hire people, what do you need to do your job properly? Very open questions. How are you doing? What are you finding challenging? To create that environment that person feels open to express something, because some of the things you've touched on, Amelia, they're things that we have access to as businesses, different spaces for people to work from, access to remote working. So I just wanted to stress those points as well. So we've had another question from Laura. This is specifically around autism, Amelia, and how that can be subject to the most misconceptions. You've obviously disclosed some things that you do, and I think some of it is about that education piece, that when someone's behaving in a certain way in a meeting, for example, or they're uncomfortable, being aware of those certain things as a person to check in, are they okay? Is this, are we overstimulating, having everyone have to, be part of this group task or organised fun, as it were? But, is there anything specific that you feel firms can do to combat that stigma and ignorance towards it? Is it education, or do you have any sort of other suggestions?
Yeah, I think with autism, it's sometimes a tricky one, because how I always explain autistic language is sometimes it is a completely different language. Like, I've spent my entire life learning about holistic language and, how to fit in these social situations. So I think the way to think about it is it's not really too much to ask for people sometimes to learn about a little bit about autistic communication, because the amount of times I've got kind of funny looks for being too direct, or, if someone's decided that they don't like me, or decided that they don't want to give me work anymore because I've been too direct, or they've seen me as rude. It's quite frequent. And so sometimes it is just those little things about understanding the kind of intricacies of, how autistics communicate. And again, I think, the general adjustments also work for autistic people. Every neurodivergency faces its own set of problems within the workplace. But I think specifically, well, not specifically, but autism is obviously a spectrum. People know that, and it's the first thing that people say to me. But I don't think people always appreciate quite how different autistic people can be. People get one very set view about what an autistic person is going to be like. I was on a presentation last week, and someone was talking about how, autistic people are all bad at communicating and don't want to communicate. It's just not true. Some autistics are very chatty. Some will get happiness out of social situations. Again, it's just about seeing that these things can be done in different ways, and that applies to a whole range of autistic traits. So generally, that would be what I would say. Obviously, there's a lot more I could say in that area, but as a summary.
No, of course, and it's about that individual approach, isn't it? Which I think benefits, in terms of that line manager responsibility anyway, to be asking those questions. I'm conscious of time, so we've had questions around, should you wait for formal diagnosis? I think we share the view, no, just ask for the support you need. So I'll probably just finish with one final question for you, Amelia, which is around any examples you've seen where firms are getting it right in terms of neurodiversity inclusion that you could share to finish us off with.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's kind of one example where I'm being blown away by everything, but there are good things that are happening in the area, and often it doesn't need to be the most kind of shiny, standout initiatives that are going. Often it is that small things. Firstly, it's things like internal disability, or I've seen some specifically for neurodiversity now, which I think is great, needs to be given as the same attention as other groups. Transparency around disabled staff percentages and pay gaps. I know it's not the main thing, but things can spiral from that. We need to know there's an issue in order to build on that. Things commonly referred to as passporting schemes, which is basically a booklet of adjustments so people don't need to constantly repeat themselves to different people and can be empowered to choose who they disclose to in their workplace. And again, some of the good things I've seen is just as simple as having, in a recruitment process, just having a booklet of adjustments which they give to people, which they say, this is the type of things we could offer you. It just signifies to someone that you are looking for neurodivergent people beyond just that compliance, rather than just asking on the application scheme, do you have a disability? Again, I've seen some great things on flexibility and task swapping, flexible work arrangements without penalising people for taking up on it. And again, clear, reasonable adjustment policies that are not overly bureaucratic or invasive. And I think the main thing for me is just when I see firms being proactive and putting certain adjustments in without asking. I've been to lots of events recently where I've not even had to ask for a separate room or, subtitles on the speech or whatever it is. It's great. That's what we want. We don't want to be seen as, burdens for constantly asking for things. It should just be stuff that we do. And if there's one point to take away from it, I think that's probably it.
No, that's great. Thanks, Amelia. So we've had people asking about resources, mentoring advice. So just to reiterate, we'll make sure that there's some links available with this video. Apologies again for the issues that we've had with slides, but a massive thank you, Amelia, for your time today. We've already had comments coming through from people saying thank you for bringing these issues to the forefront and for sharing your thoughts and advice. So we'll bring that to a close now. We really do value your time in joining us and also your feedback. So if you could take the time to click the link below and provide feedback and tell us what else you'd like to hear about, then that would be great. So yeah, thanks again, Amelia, and thanks all for checking in.